What does a man with everything to lose do when he's already lost it all and doesn't even know it? Tonight, we take you inside the glittering, backstabbing world of New York's elite. Meet Damian Blackwood, a real estate titan who thought he had his wife tucked away like a dirty secret. He brought his new flame to the most public event of the year, ready to flaunt his power. But he made one fatal mistake. He forgot who his wife truly was. What happens when the woman you erased decides to write herself back into existence in a dress the color of blood and revenge? Stay tuned. The air in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was thick with the scent of money and hydrangeas. It was the night of the annual Metropolitan Legacy Gala, the undisputed pinnacle of New York City's philanthropic calendar, where old money grudgingly mingled with the new, and deals worth more than small countries were brokered over glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. At the center of one of the most sycophantic circles stood Damian Blackwood, the CEO of Blackwood Holdings. With a jawline that seemed carved from granite and a Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's cars, he exuded an aura of predatory power. At 42, he was a king in the concrete jungle, a man who didn't just build skyscrapers but reshaped the skyline to his will. Clinging to his arm was Isabella Rossi, a model-turned-influencer. She was 24 years of pure, unapologetic ambition, wrapped in a shimmering gold Chanel gown that left little to the imagination. Her laughter was a little too loud, her grip on Damian's arm a little too tight. She was a status symbol, as shiny and new as the glass towers Damian erected. "Darling," Isabella purred, loud enough for the nearby society columnist from Vanity Fair to hear. "That ghastly woman, Mrs. Astor, just gave me the most dreadful look." Damian didn't even glance in the direction of the formidable Astor matriarch. He squeezed Isabella's hand. "Let her look. She's a fossil, and this is our world now." He surveyed the room, his eyes sweeping over the faces of politicians, hedge fund managers, and tech billionaires. They were all pieces on his board. Someone, a junior partner from a rival firm, nervously approached. "Mr. Blackwood, incredible work on the Hudson Yards Pinnacle project. Truly visionary." Damian gave a curt, dismissive nod. "Vision is easy, execution is everything." He turned his attention back to Isabella, effectively erasing the junior partner from existence. This was his brand of power. Casual, cruel, absolute. He loved the way Isabella looked at him, with a mixture of awe and avarice. It was a reflection of how he saw himself. For the past year, Isabella had been his constant companion at every event that mattered. Everyone in this room knew he was married. It was an open secret, a piece of trivia they whispered about. His wife was, what was her name? Eleanor? Eliza? Something plain. She was never seen. The rumors painted her as a mousy, simple woman, a relic from his pre-billionaire days, whom he kept for the sake of appearances. Some said she was a recluse, others, more cruelly, suggested she was unwell. The most common narrative, which Damian quietly cultivated, was that she was a homebody, content to manage their sprawling Fifth Avenue penthouse and their Hamptons estate. A cleaner, he'd once drunkenly called her to a confidant, someone who kept the house in order but wasn't fit for public display. "I just can't imagine being so domestic," Isabella whispered, tracing a finger down his lapel. "A woman's place is in the spotlight, don't you think?" "Beside her man." "Exactly," Damian agreed, his chest puffing out. "Some women understand that, others don't." He thought, fleetingly and with a familiar wave of irritation, of his actual wife. Eva. Her name was Eva. He could barely picture her face without a sort of gray, domestic haze around it. She was quiet, efficient, and utterly devoid of the fire that made Isabella so intoxicating. He hadn't had a real conversation with her in months. He left her instructions via his assistant, and she ensured the household ran with the silent, flawless precision of a Swiss watch. That was her purpose. The gala's host, a silver-haired philanthropist named Arthur Vanderbilt, a man whose lineage was so old his family probably owned the original deed to Manhattan, stepped up to the microphone. The chatter in the room softened to a murmur. "Welcome, friends, patrons, and visionaries," Arthur's voice boomed, rich with authority. "Tonight, We celebrate not just the legacy of our great city, but the bold new futures we are all building together. Damien smirked. He was the future. He was building it. He drained his champagne and signaled for another. He was on top of the world. He felt invincible. Isabella leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. When are you finally going to get rid of her, Damien? The prenup can't be that bad. I want to be the real Mrs. Blackwood. Patience, my jewel, he murmured, his hand straying to the small of her back. These things take time, strategy. In truth, he'd put off the divorce because it was a messy piece of administration he couldn't be bothered with. Eva was convenient, unseen, unheard, and undemanding. Why disrupt a functional system? Arthur Vanderbilt continued his speech, but Damien had stopped listening. He was scanning the room for his next target, a Japanese investor he planned to charm. But then Arthur paused, a genuine, warm smile spreading across his face. And now, Arthur announced, his voice taking on a special resonance. We are graced by a late arrival, someone whose quiet contributions to the city's heart and soul often go unseen, but are no less monumental. A true patron of the arts and a dear friend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Eva Blackwood. The name hung in the air for a moment. Blackwood. Damien, he thought he'd misheard. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up his spine. Isabella's perfectly manicured hand tensed on his arm. Did he just say? The grand oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and there she was. Silence rippled outwards from the entrance, a wave that washed over the entire ballroom, extinguishing conversations mid-sentence. Every head turned. This wasn't the mousy gray woman from Damien's imagination. The woman standing in the doorway was a vision, an inferno. She wore a bespoke floor-length gown of scarlet silk charmeuse that clung to her figure like a second skin. The color was audacious, a slash of defiance against the room's muted palette of blacks, golds, and navy blues. Her mousy brown hair, which Damien hadn't seen out of a simple bun in years, was styled in glamorous, cascading waves of a rich chestnut, catching the light of the chandeliers. A necklace of breathtaking diamonds. The legendary Winston cluster he had thought was locked in their vault graced her collarbone, and her face, which he always found unremarkable, was transformed. Her makeup was subtle yet striking, accentuating high cheekbones he'd never noticed, and a full, crimson-painted mouth set in a look of serene, unassailable confidence. She wasn't just a woman in a red dress, she was the embodiment of power. She paused at the threshold, her cool, gray eyes sweeping across the stunned assembly, a queen surveying her court. She didn't look angry or hurt. She looked like she owned the place, and then her eyes found his. Across the sea of shocked faces, she held his gaze. There was no flicker of emotion in her eyes, no pain, no jealousy, just a calm, chillingly clear assessment. It was the look of a predator that had just spotted its prey. Isabella gasped, her voice a panicked squeak. Damien, who is that? Damien couldn't speak. His throat was tight, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion. Fear. The world he had so carefully constructed, the narrative he had so meticulously controlled, had just been blown apart by a woman in a red dress. His cleaner wife had just walked in, and she had come to clean house. The silence in the ballroom stretched for an eternity, thick and heavy. It was broken by a single, authoritative voice. Eva, my dear, you finally made it. Arthur Vanderbilt descended the dais with the spryness of a man half his age. He strode towards Eva, his arms outstretched, completely ignoring the collective gasp of the city's elite. He kissed her on both cheeks, a familiar, affectionate gesture that spoke of a deep and long-standing rapport. You look absolutely breathtaking, Arthur declared, his voice carrying through the now silent room. That dress, a masterpiece, is that a new Galliano? Eva's lips curved into a small, enigmatic smile. He made a few adjustments for me. I'm glad you approve, Arthur. Her voice was not the quiet, hesitant thing Damien remembered. It was low, melodious, and carried the effortless authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. The spell was broken. A frantic, high-pitched wave of whispering erupted throughout the ballroom. Is that her? I thought she was frumpy. My God, look at the Winston diamonds. What is going on? Damien stood frozen, a statue of disbelief and rising fury. Isabella was tugging at his sleeve, her face a mask of panic. Damien, do something. Everyone is staring. She's making a scene. But Damien couldn't move. His brain was struggling to reconcile the two images of his wife. The one in his mind was a ghost who haunted the hallways of his penthouse, clad in beige cardigans and sensible shoes, her greatest ambition for the day being to ensure the polish was correctly applied to the mahogany. This woman, this creature of fire and diamonds, was a stranger. Eva, with Arthur Vanderbilt on her arm, began to move through the room. It was not the hesitant, wallflower shuffle of a social novice. It was a royal procession. People parted before her as if by instinct. The city's most powerful figures, men and women who would barely give Damien the time of day, turned to greet her with deference and warmth. Eva, darling, you must come visit us in the Hamptons, cooed Beatrice de la Renta, a woman who controlled three of the country's most influential art foundations. Mrs. Blackwood, a word, if I may, beckoned Kenji Tanaka, the very Japanese investor Damien had been planning to corner. My wife and I were just admiring the gallery you endowed at the Met. Damien's head was spinning. The gallery? Eva had endowed a gallery? With what money? His money? He hadn't approved any such donation. He would have known. The accounts, the trusts, the foundations, he controlled them all, didn't he? He watched, dumbfounded, as his meek, invisible wife held court, discussing Impressionist art with one person and the finer points of a recent Supreme Court ruling with another. She moved with an elegance and intelligence he had never, not once, glimpsed. It was as if she had been hiding an entire universe of herself from him. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up his neck. He was being upstaged, eclipsed in his own world, by the woman he had dismissed as little more than a high-class housekeeper, and she was doing it without so much as a single accusatory glance in his direction. Her indifference was more insulting than any screaming match could ever be. She was simply erasing him, just as he had tried to erase her. Isabella, realizing she had become an accessory to her lover's public castration, was practically hyperventilating. This is a disaster. She planned this, Damien. This is an attack. Be quiet, he hissed, his voice dangerously low. The shock was finally beginning to curdle into a cold, hard rage. He dislodged Isabella's hand from his arm and started to push his way through the crowd towards his wife. The sycophants who had been surrounding him only moments before now averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engaged in conversation. The shark had blood in the water, and it was his own. He reached her just as she was finishing a conversation with a senator. Arthur Vanderbilt saw him coming, and his genial expression hardened into a subtle, protective glare. Eva, Damien said, his voice tight. He tried to project authority, but it came out sounding strained. She turned to face him slowly. Up close, the transformation was even more jarring. The eyes that he remembered as perpetually downcast were now looking straight at him, clear and steady. They were the color of a stormy sea. Damien, she acknowledged him, her tone perfectly neutral, as if greeting a passing acquaintance. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, keeping his voice low and vicious. What game are you playing? Her lips curved into that same infuriating, serene smile. Game. I'm simply attending a gala, Damien. I believe my invitation specified my name, Mrs. Eva Blackwood. Surely you haven't forgotten it? You've never come to one of these before. Ever. I was busy, she replied simply. Busy? Busy doing what? Arranging flowers? He sneered, the insult reflexive. For the first time, a flicker of something, not pain but perhaps pity, crossed her face. Yes, something like that. Arranging things. Putting them in their proper place. She let her gaze drift meaningfully past his shoulder to where Isabella stood, wringing her hands and looking utterly lost. You seem to have misplaced one of your accessories. The gold is a bit garish for this lighting, don't you think? It looks desperate. Damien felt the blood rush to his face. You will not speak to me like that. We are leaving. Now. He reached out to grab her arm, the way he would to signal a dismissal. Before his fingers could touch the scarlet silk, Arthur Vanderbilt stepped smoothly between them, his body blocking Damien's advance. "I don't believe Mrs. Blackwood is ready to leave, Damien," Arthur said, his voice now devoid of all its earlier warmth. It was the voice of a man who could buy and sell entire corporations with a single phone call. "In fact, she and I have a great deal to discuss with Mr. Tanaka regarding the new wing of the Children's Hospital, a project she has been spearheading." Damien stared at the old man, then back at his wife. The Children's Hospital? That was a $10 million pledge. He would know. He had to sign off on it. A cold dread, colder than any fear he had ever known, began to seep into his bones. It was a fundamental, terrifying doubt. The world was not operating according to the rules he had written. Eva gave him a final, dismissive look. "You should go back to your guest, Damien. She looks like she's about to cry. It's so unbecoming. Try to enjoy the party. I know I will." With that, she turned her back on him, took Arthur's offered arm and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the most powerful room in New York. The whispers of the crowd like the hissing of snakes all around him. He was no longer the king. He was the court jester. And the queen, a woman he never even knew existed, had just made her first move. Damien stood there for a full minute, rooted to the spot. The ambient noise of the gala returned, but it sounded different now, distorted. Every laugh seemed to be at his expense, every whisper a conspiracy against him. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, their gazes a mixture of pity, amusement, and schadenfreude. This was a blood sport for them, and he was the evening's entertainment. He turned on his heel, his face a thunderous mask, and stalked back towards Isabella. She flinched as he approached, as if expecting him to lash out. "Get your coat," he snarled. "What?" "But the party is over," he bit out, grabbing her by the elbow, his grip far from gentle. He dragged her towards the exit, ignoring the way she stumbled in her heels. He needed to get out. He needed air. He needed to re-establish control. As he pushed through the throng, he saw Kenji Tanaka, the Japanese investor, in deep, animated conversation with Eva and Arthur Vanderbilt. Tanaka laughed at something Eva said, then nodded earnestly, his body language one of deep respect. The $10 billion Hudson Yards deal, for which Tanaka's backing was crucial, flashed in Damien's mind. A deal he had been working on for 6 months. A deal he had considered a certainty. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. Once outside, the cool night air did little to quell the furnace of his rage. The valet, seeing his face, practically sprinted to retrieve his car, a custom black Bugatti. "What the hell was that, Damien?" Isabella cried, finally finding her voice once they were cocooned in the car's leather interior. "She humiliated you. She humiliated us." "She did nothing," Damien snapped, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "She showed up. That's all. It's a pathetic cry for attention." But he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that it was not. This was not a cry for attention. This was a declaration of war. A cry for attention? In vintage Winston diamonds and a custom gown? Looking like that? Isabella's voice was shrill with jealousy and fear. "And Arthur Vanderbilt, he acted like she was the Queen of England. You told me she was nobody." "She is nobody," he insisted, more to convince himself than her. He floored the accelerator, the Bugatti's engine roaring in protest as they shot down Fifth Avenue. "She's my wife, legally. That's all. She handles the houses. She has an allowance. A very generous one. That's where the dress came from. She emptied her bank account to throw a tantrum. But the diamonds? The Winston cluster was a family heirloom. His family heirloom. It was supposed to be in the main vault in their penthouse, a vault to which only he knew the complete code. He had checked it himself a few months ago. Hadn't he? He pushed the thought away. He would deal with Eva. He would go home, find her there, and she would crumble, just as she always did whenever he raised his voice. She would dissolve into tears and apologies, and he would be back in control. He would put her back in her box, lock it, and throw away the key. Then he would call his lawyers and start the divorce proceedings first thing in the morning. He was done with her. He dropped a sobbing Isabella at her Soho apartment with a curt, "I'll call you tomorrow," and sped towards his penthouse. As he rode the private elevator up 60 floors, he rehearsed his speech. It would be brutal, swift, and final. When he burst into the penthouse, he expected to find her waiting, perhaps in her sensible nightgown, the fiery red dress discarded, the illusion shattered. But the penthouse was silent and dark. "Ava," he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous marble foyer. No answer. He strode through the apartment. The living room, with its panoramic views of Central Park, was immaculate. The kitchen was spotless. Their wing of the residence was empty. Her dressing room, a vast space he rarely entered, was the first sign that something was profoundly wrong. It was half empty. Entire racks of the drab, colorless clothing he was used to seeing were gone. Her jewelry box, usually overflowing with the tasteful but modest pieces he'd bought her over the years, was open and mostly empty. Only the lesser items remained. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his anger. He rushed to the study, to the large steel vault hidden behind a false bookshelf. He punched in his code. It beeped green. He swung the heavy door open. The velvet-lined drawers were in disarray. His collection of Patek Philippe watches was gone. Bearer bonds he kept for emergencies. Gone. And the main box, the one that held the Blackwood family jewels, including the Winston cluster, was empty. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tucked into the space where the diamond necklace used to be was a single folded piece of paper. It was thick, expensive stationery, the kind he had never seen before. It bore a simple embossed crest at the top, a stylized V. His hands shaking, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was a perfect, elegant script. "Damien, I've taken what is mine. You may want to have your lawyers look into the original charter for Blackwood Holdings, specifically the stipulations tied to the initial seed funding from the Sterling Group 20 years ago. You were so eager to get started, I doubt you ever read the fine print. Consider my appearance tonight a professional courtesy, a notification that your probationary period has expired. Regards, Eva Sterling Blackwood Vance." The name hit him like a physical blow. Sterling Group. It was a shadowy investment firm that had given him his first big break. A $5 million investment that had allowed him to purchase his first major property. The deal was brokered through lawyers. He'd never met the principals. They had one condition, that he would enter into a personal and binding contract with a representative of their choosing. He had been a hungry, ambitious young man. He hadn't cared. He'd assumed it was some strange tax loophole or an eccentric old man's whim. The representative had been Eva Sterling, a quiet, plain-looking girl, fresh out of business school. The marriage was the contract. He had thought it was a small price to pay for his empire. He'd seen her as a stepping stone, a quiet partner he could easily sideline once he was established. He never imagined, he never once considered, that she was the Sterling Group. His phone buzzed, shattering the silence. It was his CFO, David Chen. It was almost 2 a.m. "David, what is it?" Damien barked, his voice hoarse. "Damien, thank God, I've been trying to reach you. All hell is breaking loose." David's voice was strained with panic. "Tanaka's fund just pulled their letter of intent for the Pinnacle project. They're out, no explanation. And that's not all. The board has called an emergency meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. I got the notification an hour ago. It was triggered by a majority shareholder action." Damien sank into his leather office chair, the note from Eva crushed in his fist. "Majority shareholder? That's impossible. I am the majority shareholder. I control 55%. "Not anymore," David said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "According to this filing, a holding company called Sterling Consolidated has just exercised its options. Options that were apparently embedded in the company's founding charter. Damien, they control 60%. As of 9:30 p.m. this evening, the time of the gala, the moment she had walked through those doors. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a scene. It was a corporate takeover. The cleaner hadn't just put on a red dress. She had been sharpening her knives for 20 years, and she had just plunged the first one directly into his back. The foundation of his empire wasn't just cracked. It had been built on quicksand, and he was sinking fast. The next few hours passed in a surreal blur of disbelief and mounting terror. Damien sat in his silent, plundered office. the city lights twinkling below like mocking eyes. He had been running on pure adrenaline and rage, but now a chilling, profound sense of dread was seeping in, colder and more paralyzing than the midnight air. He called his legal team, waking up his top corporate lawyer, a ruthless shark named Marcus Adler. Marcus, get the team together. Now we have a hostile takeover situation. A what? Marcus's sleepy voice snapped to attention. Who? We have defenses for that. It's an internal action. Sterling Consolidated. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Vance, I've heard the name. Ghost firm. Old money. I thought they were defunct. They're not, Damien grated, and they're claiming majority ownership. Dig into the original charter. I want to know everything. Every loophole, every clause. Damien, this is a 20-year-old document. I don't care if it was written on a stone tablet by Moses. Find me a way out of this, and find out who Eva Sterling is. I want to know her family, her history, everything. He hung up and stared at the note again. Probationary period. The words were an insult of unimaginable arrogance. His life, his success, his entire identity as a self-made titan, had it all been a test? A long-term performance review conducted by the quiet woman he shared a home with. The absurdity of it was almost enough to make him laugh, but the sound that escaped his throat was a choked, desperate gasp. He began to frantically search his own digital archives, pulling up the original incorporation documents for Blackwood Holdings, and there it was, a name he hadn't thought about in 2 decades, Sterling Group LLC, listed as the primary seed investor. He scrolled through the dense legalese, his eyes scanning for the clauses Marcus had mentioned. He found it in an appendix, under a section titled Special Covenants. The language was archaic, convoluted, but the meaning was brutally clear. The Sterling Group's investment was contingent on the personal union between Damien Blackwood and Eva Sterling. The shares they held, a formidable 20% at the time, came with dormant options. These options could be triggered by a breach of fiduciary or personal faith, as determined by a majority vote of the Sterling Group's secretive board. Upon activation, these options would convert a series of preferred, non-voting shares held in offshore trusts into common voting stock, granting Sterling Consolidated, the group's primary holding company, a controlling interest of 60%, a breach of personal faith. He had brought his mistress to a gala and publicly flaunted her. He had treated the principal of the Sterling Group like a servant for 2 decades. It wasn't just a breach, it was a detonation. Who was she? The answer came not from his frantic lawyers, but from a simple, public source. He typed Eva Sterling into a search engine. For years, this search had yielded nothing, as if she were a ghost. But now something had changed. The privacy shields were down. The first result was a recent press release from the Vanderbilt Foundation, announcing Mrs. Eva Sterling Blackwood as its new chairperson. The second was an article from a niche art world journal detailing her anonymous, multi-million-dollar acquisitions of modern art over the past decade. The third and most damning was a link to an old archived article from the Wall Street Journal from 30 years ago, titled The Reclusive Genius of Wall Street, Who is Alexander Vance? The article described Alexander Sterling as a legendary but intensely private financier, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire in the 70s and 80s through shrewd, almost prescient investments. He was a kingmaker who despised the spotlight. The article mentioned he had one heir, a daughter, Eva, who was said to have inherited his brilliant strategic mind. After Alexander Vance's death, the family and their fortune had seemingly vanished from the public eye, managed by a labyrinth of trusts and holding companies. Damien felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't married the daughter of a minor investor. He had married the sole heiress to one of the most powerful and secretive fortunes in the country. He had been handed the keys to the kingdom and had been too arrogant, too self-absorbed to even realize he was holding them. He started to see the last 20 years in a horrifying new light. The lucky breaks, the uncanny timing of his property acquisitions, the way rivals would suddenly and inexplicably back out of a deal. He had attributed it all to his own genius, his gut instinct. But was it? He remembered a time 10 years ago when a competitor, a ruthless developer named Silas Croft, was about to snatch a prime piece of midtown real estate from him. Damien had been outmaneuvered. Then, overnight, Croft's primary lender had pulled his financing due to a sudden, unexpected regulatory scandal. Damien had swept in and bought the property for a fraction of its worth. He'd celebrated it as his most brilliant victory. He remembered Eva being quiet and withdrawn for a few weeks around that time, spending long hours in her home office, a room he never entered. He'd assumed she was planning a dinner party. He now saw her as she must have been, a ghost in his machine, the silent strategist behind the curtain, cleaning up his messes, clearing his path, ensuring the investment, him, yielded the expected returns. She wasn't the housekeeper. She was the architect. He was just the flashy facade she'd built. The call from Marcus came back around 7 a.m. The lawyer sounded exhausted and defeated. "It's ironclad, Damien. Whoever drafted this was a legal genius or a sadist. The covenants are tied to the very DNA of the company. You can't separate them. The marriage, your personal conduct, it was all part of the deal. By publicly disrespecting her, you gave her everything she needed to trigger the breach of faith clause. It's airtight." "So what do I do?" Damien asked, his voice hollow. "You go to that meeting at 9 a.m. and you pray," Marcus said bluntly. "You pray she's willing to negotiate a severance package. Because as of right now, you don't own a controlling interest in your own company. You're just an employee. And I have a feeling your annual review is going to be brutal." Damien didn't even bother to change his tuxedo from the night before. It was rumpled and smelled of stale champagne and failure. He walked into the Blackwood Holdings boardroom at 8:59 a.m. The long mahogany table was already filled. His board members, men he had handpicked, men who had profited immensely from his leadership, refused to meet his eye. They stared at the table, at their phones, at anything but him. At the head of the table, in the chairman's seat, his seat, sat Eva. She was no longer in the defiant red of the gala. Today she was dressed in a severe, exquisitely tailored, navy blue power suit. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon. She wore no jewelry except for a simple, elegant watch on her wrist. She looked calm, focused, and utterly in command. Arthur Vanderbilt sat at her right hand, his expression grim and resolute. Damien stood at the opposite end of the table, feeling like a defendant in the dock. Eva didn't waste time on pleasantries. She looked at him, her gray eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter sky. "Good morning, Damien," she said, her voice crisp and clear, amplified by the room's acoustics. "Thank you for joining us. We have a great deal to discuss. The first item on the agenda of Sterling Consolidated, the new majority shareholder of this company, is the leadership of Blackwood Holdings. The floor is now open for motions." Arthur Vanderbilt spoke immediately, his voice resonating with gravitas. "I, Arthur Vanderbilt, representing the Vanderbilt Trust, and as a proxy for the board of Sterling Consolidated, move to remove Damien Blackwood from his position as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the board, effective immediately, for gross mismanagement and breach of fiduciary and personal duty as stipulated in the founding charter." It was a coup de grace delivered with surgical precision. The unraveling was complete. He had spent his life building a tower, only to find out at the very top that he didn't even own the land it was built on. The motion hung in the sterile, air-conditioned boardroom. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of Damien's own ragged breathing. He looked down the long, polished table at the faces of his board members. He saw no support, no loyalty, only fear and self-preservation. They were rats, and the ship was sinking. "Is there a second?" Eva asked, her voice calm and even. A hand went up. It belonged to David Chen, his CFO, the man who had been his right hand for a decade. David wouldn't look at him. "I second the motion," David mumbled, his face pale. "All in favor?" Eva's gaze swept the room. One by one, hands were raised. Unanimous. It was over. In less than 5 minutes, 20 years of his life's work, his identity, his very name, had been stripped from him. He was no longer Damien Blackwood, the Titan. He was just Damien. A bitter, hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from his chest. "So this is it," he said, his voice cracking. 20 years. I built this company from nothing, and you waltz in and take it with a piece of paper?" Ava leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. For the first time, she allowed a sliver of emotion to show in her eyes. Not anger, but a profound, weary disappointment. "You didn't build this from nothing, Damien," she said, her voice cutting through his self-pity. "You built it with my family's money. You built it with my father's reputation, and you built it with my strategies. I was the ghost in your machine, the cleaner who tidied up your impulsive messes and turned your half-baked ideas into profitable realities." She gestured to a screen on the wall. It flickered to life, showing a complex flowchart of shell corporations and offshore accounts, all linked to a central entity, Sterling Consolidated. "The deal with Silas Croft 10 years ago," she continued. "His lender didn't just pull his financing. I bought his debt through a third-party entity and called it due. The zoning variance for the East River Tower that miraculously got approved. I spent 6 months lobbying the city council through a foundation I control. The hostile takeover you fought off from Sterling Global. Sterling Global is and always has been a subsidiary of the Sterling Group. It was a test, Damien. One of many you failed." The board members shifted uncomfortably. They were hearing for the first time that the company's greatest triumphs were not the work of the man at the end of the table, but the quiet woman at the head. "I honored my father's wishes," Ava said, her voice dropping slightly. "He believed you had potential, a raw ambition that, if properly guided, could create something magnificent. He made the marriage a condition because he knew you couldn't be trusted. He wanted someone on the inside to protect his legacy. I was that protector. My only duty was to the company and the Sterling name. Your role was to be the face, the engine, and in return for that privilege, all you had to do was show a modicum of respect, of decency." She paused and her gaze hardened again. "But your ego couldn't allow for a silent partner. You had to believe you were a self-made king. So you diminished me. You erased me. You kept me in a gilded cage and called me your cleaner. And then you had the audacity to flaunt your infidelity, your disloyalty, in the most public forum imaginable. You didn't just breach a contract, Damien. You spit on my father's grave. You made it personal." He had nothing to say. There were no arguments left. Every word she spoke was a nail in his coffin. "The vote is passed," Eva announced, her tone shifting back to business. "Damien Blackwood is removed from all positions at this company, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your personal effects from the office will be couriered to an address of your choosing. The company car, the penthouse, the jet, they are all corporate assets. You will have 24 hours to vacate the residence." Security. She was having him thrown out of his own building like a disgraced mailroom clerk. The humiliation was absolute, a perfect, crushing weight. "As for your compensation," she added, as if as an afterthought, "your employment contract is now void due to gross misconduct. However, the prenuptial agreement we both signed is still very much in effect. I am a believer in honoring contracts." A tiny spark of hope flickered within him. The prenup. It was ironclad, written by his own lawyers. It protected his assets completely. Eva saw the look on his face, and her lips twisted into a wry, merciless smile. "It states that, in the event of a divorce, you will retain all assets held in your name, and I will retain all assets held in mine. A fair arrangement." She gestured to the screen again. "As you can see, all major assets, the stock portfolio, the real estate, the art collection, the cash reserves, have always been held in trust by Sterling Consolidated. You, Damien, personally own a checking account with a balance of $78,000, a portfolio of speculative stocks that are currently down 90%, and a vintage motorcycle. I have no claim on them. They are all yours." The room spun. He was not just fired. He was ruined. 2 uniformed security guards, men who had saluted him that morning, entered the room and stood on either side of him. It was time. As he was led out, a pariah in his own kingdom, his phone buzzed. He looked down. It was a text from Isabella. "I just saw the news alerts. Is it true? Are you really out? They're saying you're broke. Please tell me it's not true." He didn't have to answer. A minute later, another notification popped up. It was from Instagram. Isabella Rossi just posted a new story. He clicked on it, a masochistic impulse driving him. It was a black screen with white text. Sometimes you learn the truth about people, and you have to make the difficult choice to walk away and protect your own peace, sending love and light to everyone who has been deceived. Know your worth, nourish new beginnings. She had already cut him loose, repositioning herself as a victim before his office chair was even cold. The final pathetic betrayal. As the elevator doors closed, cutting off his view of the Blackwood Holdings logo, Damian Blackwood finally understood. Eva wasn't just a cleaner, she was a demolitions expert, and she had just brought his entire world crashing down around him. The red dress wasn't a statement. It was a warning siren, and he had been too deafened by his own arrogance to hear it. 1 month later, the name on the gleaming skyscraper at the heart of Manhattan had changed. The bold, aggressive letters spelling out Blackwood Holdings were gone, replaced by a quieter, more elegant script. Sterling Enterprises. The change was more than symbolic. It was a rewriting of history. The city which thrived on scandal had moved on. Damian Blackwood was last week's news, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. After being unceremoniously dumped by Isabella via an Instagram story, he had become a ghost. The tabloids reported he had vacated the Fifth Avenue penthouse and was staying with an old college friend in a small apartment in Queens. His speculative stocks had been liquidated to pay Marcus Adler's legal fees for a lawsuit he had no hope of winning. He was a king in exile, stripped of his power, his fortune, and his name. Isabella Rossi had attempted to leverage her proximity to the scandal into a reality TV show deal. But without Damian's influence, the producers saw her for what she was, a fleeting, forgettable accessory. Her 15 minutes of fame were up, but for Eva Sterling Blackwood, it was a new dawn. She stood in the CEO's office, her office, looking out at the panoramic view of Central Park. The space had been completely redecorated. The dark, heavy mahogany and black leather of Damian's reign were gone, replaced with light woods, soft gray furnishings, and minimalist art. It was a space that was calm, controlled, and confident. She had not taken Damian's name off the door, only to insert her own in its place. She had fundamentally changed the company's direction. The first thing she did as CEO was halt 2 of Damian's most aggressive, high-leverage development projects that risked destabilizing the company for the sake of his ego. Instead, she redirected those funds into the charitable wing of the company, fully funding the new children's hospital wing and establishing a new foundation for affordable housing initiatives in the city's underserved boroughs. The move was met with skepticism from some of the old guard on Wall Street, who saw it as soft, but with praise from the press and the public. Under Damian, Blackwood Holdings had been seen as a predator. Under Eva, Sterling Enterprises was quickly becoming known as a pillar of the community. Her quiet, strategic philanthropy over the years had built a reservoir of goodwill that she was now cashing in. The stock price, after an initial dip, had stabilized and was now climbing steadily. Arthur Vanderbilt walked into her office, holding 2 cups of coffee. "The board has approved the housing initiative," he said, a proud smile on his face. "Unanimously. David Chen is proving to be a surprisingly effective CFO now that he's not living in fear." Eva took the cup, her lips curving into a small smile. "David is a good man. He was just working for a bad one. He understands our new mission, to build a legacy, not just an empire." "And what of Damian?" Arthur asked, his tone gentle. Eva's smile faded slightly. She looked out at the city skyline. "He received the divorce papers yesterday. My lawyers informed me he signed them without contest. He gets to keep his motorcycle." There was no triumph in her voice, only a quiet finality. The war was over. The house was clean. "Do you ever regret it?" Arthur asked. "The years you spent in the shadows?" Eva was silent for a moment, contemplating his question. "I used to," she admitted. "I resented the promise I made to my father. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, but I came to see it as a period of education. I learned how power truly works, not the loud, showy kind that Damian craved, but the quiet, invisible kind that moves the world. I learned patience, and I learned that you can't see the whole board if you're one of the pieces. You have to be the player." She turned from the window, her eyes clear and focused. I'm not in the shadows anymore. This was never about revenge, Arthur. Revenge is a messy, emotional affair. This was a correction, a restoration of order. I didn't destroy Damien's company. I took back my own. Her phone chimed. It was a message from Kenji Tanaka. Ava-san, congratulations on the new direction. We would be honored to reconsider our investment in a project guided by your vision. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. It was the smile of a woman who was finally, completely free. She had walked into that gala in a dress the color of defiance, a woman no one knew. Now she was Eva Sterling, and the whole world was about to learn her name. The cleaner had finished her work, and the result was spotless. And so, Eva Sterling's story isn't just one of revenge. It's a masterclass in reclaiming power. She didn't just get even, she got everything. She proved that the most powerful person in the room isn't always the loudest, but the one who understands the game better than anyone else. She went from being an invisible wife, a cleaner, to the woman in charge of it all, not by tearing someone down, but by revealing the strength she had held all along. If you were inspired by Eva's incredible journey from the shadows to the CEO's chair, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own hidden power, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of justice and transformation. We have one question for you. What do you think Damien's biggest mistake was? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.